Please listen carefully.
Hi, I'm Paul Frields.
I'm Dave Guzman.
And welcome to Practical Bass, where each week we pick a topic of interest to you, the working bass player, and we look at it from a bunch of different angles and explore it and talk about our experiences and hopefully invite you, the listeners, to share your thoughts and experiences with us. You can do that in a bunch of ways. You can find us on our website at practicalbass.com or email us at podcast@practicalbass.com. You can also find us on Facebook. We interact with our listeners there. We have a new Facebook group, which makes it even easier for you to raise questions with each other, with other listeners, with us, and we love to monitor that and talk to our listeners. So we hope we'll hear from you. I do have to say, we appear on a bunch of other social media as well: Twitter, Instagram, Google Plus, but Facebook by far, I think we get the most people corresponding with us there. And this week we have I think we have a special entry, right? That came out of our a Facebook discussion.
Yeah. Chris Cox, who is a listener, he wrote in with asking us to present on a topic.
That's right, and that means that this is our second instance of listener mail, right?
That's right.
Excellent. Yeah. So Chris wrote in about amps, and specifically, somehow I think the topic had come up about ratings like ohms and wattage and things like that.
Right.
And he was specifically, I think, asking about how do you deal with those numbers? Like, how do you deal with the ratings of amps? How do you know what they mean? Mm-hmm. How do you match the right pieces together, and so on and so forth? Yeah, I think that'll make a great topic for today. And we want to thank Chris for writing in with the idea. So, Dave, the amp that you're using right now, like your most used, most favorite amp, what is the rating on that amp?
Yes, that is it's 350 watts right into an 8 ohm, and then or like 500 watts into 4 ohms.
Yeah.
Which is just like a bunch of numbers.
It is. We're just starting off with the numbers game.
That's how we're going to throw it right like that.
That's okay. We're putting it out there. We're putting the numbers out there. And then as we go, hopefully we can make some sense out of, explaining what these mean and why those change.
Right.
So, on the other hand, I mean, I know I've talked about it before. Again, we're not getting any money from these guys. Just I'm using it as an example. I have a Little Mark Tube 800, a Mark bass head, and it's 500 watts into 8 ohms,
right?
Or it does 800 watts into 4 ohms,
right?
So a little bit, a little bit higher.
Right.
All that means basically is just the power rating on the amp is higher. It doesn't necessarily mean I run it louder automatically or anything like that.
Right.
So yeah.
And do you know so the speakers that you're matching up to, then do you know what those are at? Yeah.
So the cabinet that I use most often with it is a 2x10. It's a Mark Bass Traveler 102P, which is their 2x10. It's like a really light cabinet, and it's an 8 ohm cabinet.
Right.
So that means that when I hook it up to that amp, it's operating at basically maximum of 500 watts.
Right.
Into that. Now, so your amp, do you know, is yours like a speaker? I think you have a combo, right?
Yeah. So because it's a combo, so they do, they match. It's designed, right? To be a combo. So I think it's set up as 8 ohm, 400 watt max, right?
Yeah.
A little bit higher than what the amp can actually do. But it has a feature where because I can use 4 ohms, so I can actually throw in another cabinet.
Yeah.
On top of that.
Yeah. So it has like an extension.
Right.
You can add a cabinet and run it to 4 ohms. So those extensions and how that works, that's probably this part of the mystery that Chris was writing in about. So hopefully we can talk a little bit about this. one of the notes I made here was on explaining Ohm's law. And I realized at some point, I'm like, that's not even the right way to look at it. So, I mean, Ohm's law is a real thing, right? I'm trying to, so if I remember correctly, I think it's I equals V over R, I think, which is like amps equals volts over resistance in ohms,
right?
If I remember correctly. But that doesn't really help that much in the case of being a bass player.
Right.
Like, that's not a bad thing to know, I guess, if you're an electrician. But what we really care about are the measurements on our amps, which are all basically going to be running at either 110 volts or 220 volts.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a transformer that's going to, turn that into the power that the amp needs to run, and it's going to regulate properly so that you're not going to plug this amp in Europe and suddenly your amp is like twice as powerful because you plugged into 220 volts. So really what we're talking about is wattage, the watts, and then resistance or impedance, which is the ohms. Right. So the impedance on your speaker cabinets, here's how you can think about it. Impedance on your speaker cabinet is basically like a gate. So think of the current like you would water in a river.
Right.
Impedance is like having a dam.
Yep.
A partial dam on the river, or think of it as an adjustable dam, right? And the more ohms you have, the more you've adjusted that gate closed against the current, right?
Yep.
So really what happens is the wattage on your amp is going to depend on, I should say the wattage, the power that's the amp is going to produce is going to depend on the impedance of the cabinets that it's hooked to.
Right.
Now, it turns out that there are amps out there nowadays, quite a few of them, that you can run without any impedance whatsoever. So there are some amps that are made so that if you don't plug in a cabinet to them, it's fine. They're happy to do that, right? You can run it just to headphones.
Right.
And then you could turn around, take that amp and plug it into a cabinet and run it at full power, right?
Right.
Not every amp is built to do that though, right? Vintage amps especially, if you try and run them without any cabinet, you could have problems.
Yeah.
And those problems can be as severe as basically the amp like overheating and dying, like, literally starting a fire.
Which is good for a rock and roll gig. Like, for that key moment.
Yeah. Yeah, when you really need the pyrotechnics and your amp just like explodes on stage.
It's got to be a last note kind of situation, but if you can time it, and that's the last show ever, you're never playing music again, do it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. So, so what happens with cabinets? I mean, the reason people think about, it's easy to think about the wattage and the impedance, right? The wattage and the ohms, and simply attach one cabinet to one amp.
Yeah.
And you're good to go, right? Oh, okay, this amp works 500 watts at 8 ohms. If I attach an 8 ohm cabinet to it, it's going to run it'll run up to 500 watts.
Right.
That's easy, right? Very easy. What I think throws people is that as you add a cabinet, you change the impedance, and it's not adding impedance. Like if I add another 8 ohm cabinet, that doesn't mean the impedance is 16 ohms. It actually means that it's 4 ohms.
Right.
We'll go into why that is in a minute. You have a formula. You know the formula for this.
Yeah.
And what is that? So if I cabinet A and cabinet B,
right,
and say A is 8 ohms and B is 8 ohms, then what is like, how do I figure out what the new impedance is?
So it would be like cabinet A ohms times cabinet B ohms.
Okay. So I multiply those to get those together. So 8 times 8, which is 64.
Right. Divided by cabinet A ohms plus cabinet B ohms.
So 64 divided by 16.
Which is...
So 8 times 8 divided by 8 plus 8.
Right.
So 64 divided by 16, which is... 4 ohms.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here's the thing. People connect cabinets like this, and a lot of times don't realize that what they're doing is they are connecting the cabinets in parallel.
Right.
And the reason it may not occur to you that it's in parallel is because you're literally just sticking a cord in. So it looks like it's in series, right? I attach, like my amp goes to one cabinet, and then I attach that cabinet if it has whether there's a second out on my amp, or whether my cabinet has a second out that I then run to the other cabinet. Like it looks like you're putting them in a chain in the second case.
Right.
But you're not, because it's basically you're making a loop, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the first case, it's easy to see because you're attaching two cabinets, one to either output on the amp.
Right.
And so it looks like you're running in parallel, which you are.
Right.
But when you run them in a chain like that, it doesn't look like it, but you're still doing the same thing because you're basically attaching them in a loop because you've got multiple connections in each of those cables, at least two connections, right? If it's a speaker cable, you got a tip and a sleeve.
Right.
Right. Or if it's a speak on, you either have 2 poles or 4 poles.
That's right. Right.
So you're making a loop, and that's why they're actually in parallel there.
Yeah.
So you asked about my amp earlier, and I was telling you about my 2x10, but I also have a 1x15, and I just used that this weekend at a gig because it was an outdoor thing, and I wanted to have some brute
force.
Right. So I attached that other cabinet, and that's an 8-ohm cabinet. So when I put those together out of my amp, then it's running at 4 ohms. And so that now the amp is running at that 800 watt rating.
Right.
But here's the other thing for people to consider is that when you're running at 800 watts, the first thing you think is, well, those cabinets are only rated at 400 watts.
Right.
Am I going to overload them?
Right.
And the answer is no, you're not, because you're running into those two cabinets, but the power is distributed between them. So even if let's say that in some magical world, you could actually turn that amp up like, quote, all the way, unquote, and use all 800 watts. You couldn't really do, like, if you did that, it would be unimaginably loud. The speakers may be designed to handle the load, but no one could bear to listen to it. So it's like your bandmates would kill you before you ever got to that point. But let's say you really wanted to, you could run it at 800 watts, but what's going to happen is the 800 watts are divided between the two cabinets.
Right.
Because you're powering two cabinets. So each one's only going to get 400 of those watts.
Yeah.
So you don't need to worry about the fact that they're only rated for that, with that amp.
So and in a way that, I mean, maybe I'm missing it here, but in essence, then there's still there's more air that you're pushing in general, right? You're going to get louder when you add a 15 to your stack, right?
For sure. Yeah.
It might not be that there's more per speaker. It's just that you're adding a second speaker. Because in essence, when you start dividing it out, you're actually not putting out as much as if you would if you had just one speaker.
Yeah, it's actually going to be slightly less. You notice how when I said, like you said, your amp's rating, right, was like 350 at 8 ohms.
Right.
But it's not double that at 4 ohms. It's not 700 watts at 4 ohms. It's like 500 watts. And the reason is some of that power gets lost to heat in the amp.
Okay.
Right. So no amp is perfect. Like no amp has a perfect output. Right. With zero loss. Some of that goes to heat. There's noise, there's all sorts of other things, but mainly heat. Right. And as you run it at a lower impedance, the amp is going to lose more of its power to heat.
Right. Okay.
Which is why you could turn the amp to maybe, like, say you run it on stage, you run it let's say you run it at a volume where your volume knob's at 2, 2.5. That's probably a really comfortable, I don't know, it's going to vary amp to amp, but let's say that that's a comfortable volume for you to sit in your room and practice. If you attach a second cabinet and you turn that volume up to 2.5, you've now added another cabinet, right? The power is going to be louder. It's going to be louder, right? But what's also going to happen is your amp is going to run warmer at that point too, because it's going to be losing a little more of its output to heat. Yeah. So that's also a reason why you don't ever want to go lower than the lowest impedance that your amp is set to run at.
Right.
Right. Like, do you know is there a minimum on yours?
I don't know. No, I don't know. There may be.
Yeah, I mean, I know on mine it says minimum, a lot of amps will tell you if you look at the back plate, it'll tell you what the minimum load is. A lot of them are 4 ohms, but not all of them. But mine is 4 ohms. I've got a couple amps, not bass amps, but PA type amplifiers.
Yeah, that
are actually will tell you minimum load 2 ohms.
Right.
Which is even less, obviously. But what's going to happen is as that load gets lower. Again, more and more of the power is going to be like the percent of the power that gets wasted to heat is more.
Right.
That heat has to go somewhere, right?
Right.
And so that's why you hear an amp that's running at a very low load like that, its fan is going to be running quite a bit and it will get warm.
Yeah.
And in really bad situations, if you have like an old amp that you underload, like if you have an old tube amp with a minimum of 4 ohms and you put 2 ohms on it,
right.
That's when you're going to have that like Jimi Hendrix moment at the end of your set.
Right.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully at the end, not the beginning.
I think that's usually like where all the warnings are, The bottom line warnings is, if you've got that, if you're running it on 2 ohms and it's old, if it's a tube amp, just, that's going to be a fun night.
Right.
That's all you got. That's all she wrote.
Yeah. So there's a thing about mixing and matching too, right? I mean, we've talked about like the simple case is 2 cabinets of the same impedance.
Right.
So if you have 2 cabinets that are 8 ohms, you're going to have a load of 4 ohms.
Right.
If you have 2 cabinets that are 4 ohms, you're going to have a load of 2 ohms. Again, that's the danger territory, right?
Right.
There are 16 ohm cabinets out there too, like guitar cabinets a lot of times are 16 ohms. If you have 2 16 ohm cabinets, that means they're going to have a load of 8 ohms when you put them together.
Yep.
But those are not the only possibilities. Like you can mix and match. You can match 8 and 4 ohm cabinets. Now I don't have a calculator in front of me, but I know these are like there's some numbers. She's like if you have an 8 and a 4, so you think about it with your formula. So 8 times 4, 32. And then 8 plus 4 is 12. So whatever 32 divided by 12 is.
It's actually like 2.67.
Wow. There you go.
Isn't that so weird?
You knew that right off the top of your head.
It's
like 2.67 ohms.
Yeah. And I remember that because I had to get this calculation years ago when I was mixing and matching and I found a 4 ohm and an 8 ohm. And that's where like the search began. I was like, what happens then? Yeah. That's basically what happens. And it's still super low. Yeah. 267 is really...
That's very low. So if you'd have to think about that if you're trying to add another cabinet to your amp and you have one of the cabinets is 8 ohms and you add another cabinet that's 4 is 4 ohms, now you're at that load of 2.67.
Right.
If you look at the back plate on your amp and it says minimum load 4 ohms, that should tell you don't do that. Like you do not want to be running that.
Exactly.
It's not for more than a short time at low volume or whatever. Right. And even that, like it's simply not a good idea. And nowadays amps are a lot of times built with thermal shutoff circuits and they'll trip rather than destroy the amp. But if you're dealing with a vintage amp or something like that, do not count on that because, that's relatively recent modern technology.
Yeah.
And so if you're dealing with an old amp, you're running into a hazard there.
Yep.
So that, I guess that was a good bit about ohms and watts and how to deal with them. Do you have is there a wattage where, you're like comfortable or not comfortable, like what you like in an amp? Like, is there too much wattage for you?
I feel like, from just rigs that I've played, not even mine, but other rigs that I've played, like I feel like, if I'm playing at like 500 watts, that seems to cover everything that I usually need. Right. Because after that, I just kind of feel like it's an outdoor venue. What am I really trying to push it out, or am I plugging into a PA and it's just my personal monitor? Yeah. I mean, I've played on some rigs that were pretty heavy duty. Other guys' rigs that were like intense, and I almost this is just like a personal taste for me. I just feel like that it's probably horrible to say here, but sometimes I just feel like if it's too much bass, it's just like if I can't dial in like low enough.
Yeah. So you're saying like if it's too powerful, like and moving the dial just a little bit is a huge drop in volume because it's just so
right.
whomping big.
And then I feel like I'm playing like on the low end of which is not really like the sweet spot of an amp.
Yeah.
That probably is like the limit. And I don't know what that number is, because I didn't know what those rigs are, what the wattage was. But, when it's like the huge wall of, it's too much.
Yeah. No,
for me,
I think you're right. I mean, I do think, I used to have an amp that was, I don't know, 200 or 250 watts and just didn't have enough cojones to to be there for all the gigs.
Yeah.
Right. And I would have to get that, like the DI, just to get enough back to me, like get something in the monitors, get something up front, whatever. So for me, that 500 watts is a nice sweet spot. I mean, I think, the tube amp I have now that has this 800 watt into Ohms, that's nice, but really for me, what it is being able to have the second cabinet and push more air.
Right.
That's the point to me.
That's right.
Because essentially that's like having like 400 watts into each cabinet.
Yep.
And I did notice at this gig that I played on Saturday, I turned the amp up a good bit. I mean, I think I was running it probably 11 o'clock or 11:30 on the dial.
Right.
Which is, I mean, if I did that in here, like in the world famous Practical Bass studios, the neighbors would be like calling the cops or something like that. But out in this outdoor stage, it was great, and the sound was. I got a really great sound. Like it really had a warm, really nice tone that I liked a lot.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of like, it's a shame I can't, run it like this more often, but just
that is
bigger gigs.
It's definitely one of the nicer things about, bringing your rig outside.
Yeah.
You get to let it sing. Like you get to hear like some of that voicing that you normally don't get out of it.
Yeah. And if people are interested in some details about outdoor gigs, I mean, we had a recent show where we talked about outdoor gigs. So if you go to practicalbass.com, you can look up the episodes list and look for our show on the great outdoors.
Yeah.
Taking it to the streets. I think that's what we call that one. I mean that was a nice thing, being able to run it at like a really impressive output that I don't normally get. I mean, there are rigs out there that have a lot more power. Like you can get bass rigs out there that are 1,000 watts or 2,000 watts or something like that.
Yeah.
Really what that buys you is a huge amount of headroom.
Right.
Like the more the wattage ends up being, like the maximum rating ends up, the more headroom you have for like that very pristine, clean tone. Right.
Right.
And that's a nice thing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, like I've got a rig in the closet that's, I think, 120 watt tube amp that is one of the loudest amps I own.
Right.
Because I don't think tube amps are really the same as solid state. Like the watts aren't. If I had a 200 watt tube amp, that is nowhere near the same thing as a 200 watt solid state amp in terms of like what you hear.
Right.
So it's always something to look at. I don't know that I have a favorite wattage or anything like that. I feel like, somewhere in that like 500 watt range is just about perfect though.
Yeah.
So one other thing I think that's worth talking about is matching the speaker to the amp, even if it's at the right ohm rating.
Yeah.
But the wattage limit on the speaker is different than what the amp is.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So the number one rule is if it's close, don't worry about it. Right? If your amp is 350 watts and it's a 300 watt speaker, don't lose sleep over it.
Right.
If it's a 400 watt amp and it's a 500 watt speaker, don't lose sleep over it.
Right.
Right. Where you're going to run into issues is less often when you have a speaker that is not rated as high as the amp is.
Mm-hmm.
That is less bad than having a speaker that's rated very high and your amp is rated much lower. Because typically what that means is that the speakers are expecting more wattage to drive the cone. And if you have to turn your amp way up in order to drive them, the amp is actually going to distort. And in some cases, you end up with a nice square wave and you can blow a speaker that's rated for like 800 watts because you hooked it up to a 200 watt or 150 watt amp.
Right.
And had to turn that amp way up to be heard.
Right.
you could actually destroy the speaker that way, which seems backwards, but it is how it works.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny too, because you get into this whole world of in the PA world, and it's just from a few things that I've read where they're okay with you having, more watts coming through from your amp than your speaker. And the way that they kind of explain it is sort of like, it's just like, it's just less, it's more effortless for the amp.
Yes.
Right?
That's exactly it. It's more because the amp is producing current, and basically, you're providing more or less of that gating with the speaker, right? And the impedance is part of it, but of course there's also the rating of the speakers themselves.
Right.
And, if you don't have to turn the amp up as much to get a good sound out of the speakers, your amp's just not going to work as hard. It doesn't have to produce as much current. It doesn't have to produce as much heat.
Right.
Right. And so it's just better for the amp overall. Now, doesn't mean, run out and buy a 2,000 watt amp and hook it up to a 50 watt speaker or something like that. Probably not a great idea, but within reason, you can have some slew there. Like I've run speakers that were rated 200 or 300 watts, and I've run them off an 800 watt amplifier with no problem.
Right. Okay.
And it was exactly that case where I could just I didn't have to turn the dial really as much to get a big sound out of them. And you have to listen for distortion and things like that. But within reason, you're probably going to get louder than your audience once before it becomes a problem.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's pretty good coverage. The last thing I guess we leave you with is, always look at your manufacturer recommendations and don't go below their ohms.
Yep.
And you made a point about the tube amps, right? And which was also an important one.
Yeah. That just that in general that they respond, a lot worse than would solid state. If you're going to test those limits, if you really want to push it, just be careful.
Don't use your vintage tube amp. Like that would be really bad. Like I'm not going to go grab that amp peg and hook up a 2 ohm speaker to it just to see what happens. Because, it gets pretty warm as it is.
It could make for a fun night.
We'll roast some marshmallows. That'll be for the next show. All right. Well, that's as good a place to stop as any. We hope you guys have enjoyed listening to our explanations of wattage and impedance. If you have comments, if you have experiences that you want to share, good or bad, we hope you guys will feel free to do that. You can email us at podcast@practicalbass.com or just use the contact form on our practicalbass.com website. You can also find us on Facebook. There is a Practical Bass group, which you can reach from our Practical Bass page. We hope to hear from you there. We also are found on Twitter, Google Plus, and Instagram. Send us pictures of your rigs. If you've got a couple speakers you're not sure about matching them with an amp, take a picture of the back plate. Send it in. Let's see what we can find out together. We'd love to hear from you. The key to it is that we really want to have a relationship with you guys, our listeners. That's what matters most to us. And we hope more than anything that what you will do is share this podcast with your friends, particularly bass players, but we are open to musicians of all kinds, whatever their instruments are. We hope you will pass it on to them, and maybe they'll enjoy our little tete-a-tetes here in the Practical Bass Studios. And most importantly, subscribe. If you haven't subscribed already, you can figure out how to do that by going to the practicalbass.com website and look at our subscribe link. You can get us very easily on your computers or devices, the podcasts app on your iPhone, or the iTunes application on your Mac OS device. You can use Google Play Music on just about any device, Stitcher Radio on just about any device. Just look for Practical Bass. Use the search tool in the app to find Practical Bass, and you'll get a subscribe link. Hit that subscribe link, and you will get a new episode of Practical Bass delivered straight to your device every week. Fresh, hot off the presses. Until next time, I'm Paul Frields.
And I'm Dave Guzman.
This has been Practical Bass.
Thanks for listening. It's like playing Operation.
Yeah.
You just don't know that you're a sloppy surgeon until there's a buzzer. and you're like, oh, I do a lot of that.
Red. You're like, oh,
like, oh, okay. I guess that's
dead.
I guess I have to work on my right hand now. Back to the drawing board.